On the night of August 21st, 1831, 7 men emerged from the woods in Southampton County, Virginia, carrying axes and hatchets. They were enslaved men, and they were about to launch the deadliest slave rebellion in American history. By the time the sun set the following day, 55 white men, women, and children would be dead. The man who led them was a preacher, a mystic, someone his fellow enslaved people called the prophet. His name was Nat Turner, and for 2 days in the late summer of 1831, he turned the American South's greatest fear into reality. Nathaniel Turner was born on October 2, 1800, on a plantation in Southampton County, Virginia. He entered the world as property, owned by a man named Benjamin Turner. His mother Nancy had been brought to Virginia around 1795, likely from Saint-Domingue, modern-day Haiti, during the chaos of the Haitian Revolution. She arrived carrying with her a hatred of slavery that she would pass to her son. Nat's father remains unnamed in the historical record, but according to later accounts, he escaped from slavery when Nat was still young, vanishing into the woods and never returning. It was a lesson the child wouldn't forget. Southampton County in 1800 was tobacco and cotton country, relatively poor compared to the grand plantations of eastern Virginia. But what made it distinctive was its demographics. By 1830, black residents made up 59% of the county's population. Enslaved and free black people outnumbered whites by a ratio of nearly 3-2. This numerical majority, however, translated into no power whatsoever. If anything, it made white residents more vigilant, more fearful, more brutal in maintaining control. The county had one of the largest free black populations in Virginia, with nearly 1,800 free people of color by 1860. But their freedom was constrained by laws that limited where they could travel, when they could gather, and what opportunities they could pursue. From early childhood, people noticed something different about young Nat. He could describe events that had occurred before his birth with uncanny accuracy. He learned to read and write at a young age, taught by the son of his enslaver, something relatively unusual for enslaved children. Benjamin Turner, unlike many slaveholders, permitted this education. The boy devoured books, especially the Bible. He memorized long passages from the Old Testament, particularly drawn to the prophets and their visions of divine justice and judgment. His mother and grandmother, observing his intelligence and his strange ability to know things he shouldn't have known, told him he was destined for some great purpose. They said there were marks on his head and chest that proved it. His grandmother Bridget had been born around 1757, likely among the Akan people in what is now Ghana, and she carried African spiritual traditions that blended with the Christianity Nat absorbed from his Bible reading. When Benjamin Turner died in 1810, Nat became the property of Benjamin's son, Samuel. The family moved Nat, along with his mother Nancy, his grandmother Bridget, and several other enslaved people, to a new farm Samuel had purchased 2 miles away, a 360-acre cotton plantation. It was during these years that Nat's religious intensity deepened. He attended slave religious meetings where people sang hymns expressing their longing for freedom, where preachers spoke in vivid, emotional language about deliverance and salvation. He fasted frequently. He prayed constantly. He studied the Bible with an intensity that set him apart. The other enslaved people began calling him the prophet. He experimented with making paper and gunpowder, demonstrating a curiosity and intelligence that went far beyond what slaveholders expected or wanted from enslaved people. In 1821, when Nat was 21 years old, he ran away. For 30 days he hid in the woods, living rough, staying free. But then he did something that astonished everyone. He returned voluntarily to slavery. The other enslaved people couldn't understand it. They murmured against him, saying that if they had his intelligence, they would never serve any master in the world. But Nat explained it differently. He said he'd had a vision. The Spirit had appeared to him and told him to return to the service of his earthly master. He said his master wasn't any man on earth. His master was Jehovah, the God of ancient Israel, the God of wrath and judgment, and Jehovah had plans for him. This return, seemingly inexplicable, actually demonstrated Turner's developing sense of divine mission. He wasn't running from slavery because running was pointless. He would only leave slavery when God told him to destroy it. Around this time, Nat married. The evidence is circumstantial, but historians believe his wife was a young enslaved woman named Cherry, who lived on Samuel Turner's property. If this is true, their time together was brief. In 1822, Samuel Turner died, and the estate was divided. Cherry was sold to a man named Giles Reese. Nat was sold to Thomas Moore for $400, a price that indicated he was considered a prime field hand, despite being short in stature and slightly knock-kneed. His shoulders were broad and well-muscled from years of hard labor. The sale separated him from his wife, if indeed they were married. Under Virginia law, marriages between enslaved people had no legal standing. Families could be torn apart at any moment, and frequently were. Some evidence suggests that Nat and Cherry had a son. An enslaved boy named Riddick appears in the 1826 inventory of Joseph Reese Sr., Cherry's owner. In February 1831, just months before the rebellion, Reese's son John used this boy as collateral for a family debt. This timing is significant. Historians have noted that Turner approached his conspirators about the rebellion just days after his son was used as human collateral, treated as nothing more than a financial instrument. Whether this personal trauma contributed to Turner's decision to act, we cannot know with certainty. But it adds another layer to understanding the man and his motivations. The separation from his wife and the commodification of his son were not unusual experiences for enslaved people. They were the daily reality of slavery, the constant reminder that families meant nothing, that human bonds could be severed for money at any moment. Nat continued having visions. In 1825, while working in the fields, he experienced what he later described as a profound spiritual revelation. He said he saw white spirits and black spirits engaged in battle, and blood flowing in streams. He heard a voice telling him that the Savior was about to lay down the yoke he had borne for the sins of men, and that the great day of judgment was at hand. The voice told him to take up Christ's yoke and fight against evil. For the next several years, he said nothing about this vision to anyone as instructed. He waited for a sign. In May 1828, Turner had another powerful vision. He later said he heard a loud noise in the heavens, and the Spirit instantly appeared to him. The Spirit told him to take up the yoke of Christ, that the time was fast approaching when the first should be last, and the last should be first. He was warned not to act until he received a further sign, and not to reveal anything to anyone. He was to continue as before, working, preaching, waiting. This vision came just months before Thomas Moore died, adding to the tumultuous changes in Turner's life. Thomas Moore died in 1828, and Nat found himself in an absurd and humiliating situation. He became the legal property of Moore's 9-year-old son, Putnam Moore, a grown man, a skilled worker and preacher, owned by a child. When Putnam's mother married Joseph Travis, a wheelwright, in 1830, Nat and the other enslaved people on the Moore plantation came under Travis's supervision. Turner later recalled that Travis was a kind master who placed the greatest confidence in him. This detail is important. Nat Turner didn't launch his rebellion because of unusual cruelty from his immediate enslaver. Travis was, by the standards of slaveholders, relatively decent. But that wasn't the point. The point was the system itself. The point was that no matter how kind an individual slaveholder might be, the relationship was still one of absolute power over another human being. Still one where a person could be bought and sold and given as property to a 9-year-old child. By early 1831, Turner was convinced that God was preparing him for something momentous. He had become a preacher of sorts, conducting religious services for other enslaved people in the area. His influence extended beyond his immediate plantation. People called him the prophet. Some white people even came to hear him preach. He baptized a white man named Ethelred Brantley in a creek, reportedly convincing him to cease from his wickedness. This gave Turner an unusual degree of credibility and freedom of movement. In Southampton County's religious landscape, which was shaped by evangelical revivalism, visions and prophetic experiences were not uncommon. White preachers during the Second Great Awakening spoke of direct communication with God, of signs and wonders. Turner's religious experiences fit within this broader cultural context, even as his interpretation of what God wanted him to do diverged dramatically from what white Christians expected. Then came the signs. On February 12, 1831, an annular solar eclipse was visible across Virginia and much of the southeastern United States. To Turner, this was unmistakable. He later said he saw it as a black man's hand reaching over the sun. This was the signal he'd been waiting for. He began making preparations. He confided in 4 enslaved men he trusted completely. Their names were Henry Porter, Hark Travis, Nelson Williams, and Sam Francis. Turner told them what God had commanded him to do. They would rise up. They would slay their enemies with their enemies' own weapons. They would strike for freedom. The conspirators initially planned to launch the rebellion on July 4, 1831, Independence Day. The symbolism was deliberate. This was the anniversary of the day Americans declared that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. But Turner fell ill, possibly from fasting, and July 4th passed without incident. They continued planning in secret. The delay, however, may have been strategic as well as medical. Some historians believe Turner was waiting for coordinated action from enslaved people in North Carolina, that the rebellion was meant to be larger than what ultimately occurred. On August 13th, another atmospheric phenomenon occurred. The sun appeared bluish-green in the sky, possibly due to a volcanic plume from an eruption off the coast of Sicily. Turner took this as the final sign. He sent word to his conspirators. They would meet on Sunday, August 21st, in the woods near Cabin Pond, not far from the Travis farm. They would eat together, drink together, and then they would begin. On that Sunday afternoon, Turner's 4 original conspirators gathered in the woods. They were joined by 2 others, Will Francis and Jack Reese. They roasted a pig. They drank brandy. They discussed their plans. Some evidence suggests this rebellion was part of a larger 2-state plot involving enslaved people in North Carolina as well, though Turner never mentioned this in his later confessions. What is certain is that the 6 men agreed on their course of action. They would start at the Travis farm. They would kill everyone there. They would take weapons and horses. Then they would move from plantation to plantation, killing all the white people they encountered and recruiting enslaved people to their cause. Their ultimate goal was to reach Jerusalem, the county seat, seize the weapons stored in the armory, and, from that position of strength, continue their revolution. Around 2 o'clock in the morning on Monday, August 22nd, the group approached the Travis house. Turner was expected to strike the first blow to prove his commitment, to seal the covenant in blood. He entered the bedroom where Joseph Travis slept with his wife. He raised a hatchet and swung at Travis's head. The blow glanced off, a wild strike in the darkness. Travis sprang up, yelling for his wife, but Will Francis was right behind Turner. With what witnesses later called a sure killer's instinct, Will brought his axe down on Travis's head, killing him instantly. Within minutes, the rebels had killed all 5 people in the house, including Travis's wife, young Putnam Moore, Turner's legal owner, and a hired hand. As they were leaving, someone remembered there was an infant sleeping in a cradle. Henry Porter and Will Francis returned and killed the baby. They gathered weapons from the house, 4 guns that worked and several old muskets. They took Travis's horses. Then they moved to the next farm. At each plantation they visited, they followed the same pattern. They killed the white inhabitants, took weapons and horses, and invited enslaved people to join them. Some did. Many didn't. Even people with close personal connections to the original conspirators hesitated. Hark's brother-in-law Jack joined only reluctantly. Others, including free black men who lived on some of the farms, refused entirely. A free black man named Emory Evans, who lived on Salathiel Francis's farm, refused to join at all despite being approached directly. As they moved through the county, the rebel force grew. By late morning on Monday, they had approximately 70 men, some on horseback, armed with axes, hatchets, knives, and a few firearms. They moved quickly, hitting plantation after plantation. At the Whitehead place, Turner himself killed Margaret Whitehead, the only person he personally killed during the entire rebellion. He struck her with a fence rail after his sword proved ineffective. The highest death toll occurred at Levi Waller's farm, where Turner's men killed Waller's wife and 9 children. These weren't random acts. Turner's force was systematically striking at the heart of the slaveholding class, farm by farm, family by family. The brutality was systematic but not random. The rebels killed white people they encountered, largely sparing enslaved people unless those enslaved people actively resisted them. This was calculated terror, designed to strike fear into the heart of the slaveholding class. By Monday afternoon, they had killed at least 55 white men, women, and children. Turner later estimated the number at 57. The rebels were heading toward Jerusalem, about 3 miles away, when they encountered organized resistance. A group of 18 white militia members had assembled and positioned themselves at a farm owned by James Parker. When Turner's force arrived, the militia opened fire. Several of Turner's men were wounded. Others, drunk from raiding wine cellars at various plantations, were in no condition to fight effectively. The rebel force broke apart. Turner tried to rally them, but it was too late. Some fled into the woods. Others tried to make it back to their home plantations. By Tuesday morning, August 23rd, Turner's force had dwindled to about 20 men. They tried to recruit more people, but enslaved people who might have joined on Monday, when the rebellion seemed unstoppable, now hid or turned them away. That afternoon, Turner's remaining men encountered a much larger militia force near a plantation called Belmont. This time, the rebels were completely routed. Turner himself barely escaped. By Tuesday night, the rebellion was over. It had lasted approximately 40 hours. The speed with which it collapsed demonstrated both the improvised nature of the rebellion and the overwhelming force the state could bring to bear once organized. 3,000 armed men, militia, and federal troops converged on Southampton County. Against such numbers, the rebels had no chance. But the killing had just begun. As word of the rebellion spread, white people throughout Southampton County and neighboring areas of North Carolina panicked. Militia members poured into the area. So did armed vigilantes. Governor John Floyd mobilized approximately 3,000 men. These forces didn't just hunt the rebels, they went on a rampage. In the days and weeks following the rebellion, white mobs killed between 100 and 200 black people, most of whom had nothing whatsoever to do with Turner's rebellion. Some were enslaved people who had actually helped white families escape the rebels. Some were free black people. The militia decapitated about 15 captured rebels and mounted their heads on stakes as warnings. A newspaper editor who traveled to Southampton admitted that the white retribution was hardly inferior in barbarity to the atrocities of the rebels. One particularly tragic case involved an enslaved man named Hubbard. White interrogators didn't believe him when he said he'd saved his mistress from the rebels. They were preparing to execute him when his mistress finally appeared and confirmed his story, saving his life at the last moment. This incident revealed how indiscriminate the white retaliation was. Even black people who had risked their own lives to protect white families weren't safe from the mob. The panic was so complete, the fear so overwhelming, that distinctions between guilty and innocent, rebel and bystander, disappeared entirely. Governor Floyd eventually managed to restore some semblance of order, insisting that suspected rebels should be tried properly by the courts rather than lynched by mobs. Trials began on August 31st and continued through October. The authorities convened special courts to handle the cases. Ultimately, 30 enslaved people and 1 free black man were condemned to death. 19 were executed. Governor Floyd commuted the sentences of 12 others. The rest of the accused were acquitted or received lesser punishments. White enslavers had a financial incentive to see fair trials. Under Virginia law, the state compensated owners for enslaved people who were executed, but not for those killed by mobs. This economic consideration probably saved more lives than any sense of justice. Nat Turner remained free. For more than 2 months, he hid in Southampton County, moving between several hiding spots. For the first 6 weeks, he left his hiding place only at night to get water. For the next 2 weeks, he moved around at night gathering intelligence, listening to conversations, trying to understand the scope of the manhunt. For the final 2 weeks, after a dog discovered one of his hiding places, he was pursued almost incessantly, as he later put it. Enslaved people from a nearby plantation provided him with food when they could, risking their own lives to help him. The fact that Turner survived so long in the area where the rebellion occurred suggests he had sympathizers, people who knew where he was but chose not to reveal him. On October 30th, a white farmer named Benjamin Phipps discovered Turner hiding in a depression created by a large fallen tree covered with fence rails. This spot was later referred to as Nat Turner's Cave, though it wasn't actually a cave. Phipps was armed with a shotgun. Turner had only a small sword, which he immediately surrendered, reportedly begging that his life be spared. On October 31st, Turner was delivered to the county jail in Jerusalem. According to an observer, he looked emaciated, ragged, a mere scarecrow. The most wanted man in Virginia had been living in a hole in the ground, surviving on whatever food sympathetic enslaved people could smuggle to him. It was in that jail that Turner met Thomas Ruffin Gray. Gray was a 31-year-old lawyer from Southampton County, born the same year as Turner, but into vastly different circumstances. His family owned land and enslaved people. They had connections in local, state, and federal politics. Gray himself had owned a plantation and enslaved people. But financial troubles had destroyed his fortunes. His father and brother had fallen into debt, and when Gray tried to help them, he dragged himself down as well. By 1831, he'd lost his plantation and had been forced to sell the people he enslaved. He'd even spent time in debtor's prison. He was working as a lawyer in Jerusalem, desperate for money, when Turner was captured. He had represented several other defendants accused in the rebellion, so he was familiar with the case and its details. Gray saw an opportunity. There was enormous public interest in the rebellion. People wanted to understand what had motivated it. Gray approached Turner with a proposal. He would record Turner's full confession, the story of his life and visions and motivations. Turner agreed to talk. Over November 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, Gray interviewed Turner extensively in the jail. Turner spoke freely, answering Gray's questions in detail. Gray took notes. He asked follow-up questions. He cross-examined Turner. Then Gray compiled everything into a manuscript. Gray's description of Turner noted his intelligence and honesty, his commanding presence despite his physical condition. Whatever else Gray was, he recognized he was dealing with an exceptional person. On November 5th, Turner was tried for conspiring to rebel and making insurrection. His court-appointed attorney, James Strange French, made no arguments in his defense and called no witnesses. French had also represented several other defendants accused in the rebellion. The trial was brief. Turner pled not guilty, but was quickly convicted and sentenced to death. James Tresvant, a prominent local citizen who had been a leader in suppressing the rebellion, served on the jury. The outcome was never in doubt. From the moment Turner was captured, his execution was certain. On November 10th, the day before Turner's execution, Gray was in Washington, D.C., registering his copyright for The Confessions of Nat Turner. He moved fast. Turner was hanged on November 11th in Jerusalem. According to some accounts, he was beheaded to deter further rebellions. His body was dissected. The skin was flayed from his corpse and used to make souvenir purses. One doctor reportedly kept Turner's skeleton for medical study. In 1897, newspapers reported that a doctor in Toano, Virginia, was still using Turner's skeleton as a medical specimen, more than 65 years after his death. The desecration of Turner's body was meant as a final humiliation, a warning to anyone who might follow his example. Instead, it became another chapter in his legend. Within a week of Turner's execution, Gray's pamphlet was published in Baltimore. He printed between 40,000 and 50,000 copies. It sold phenomenally well, making Gray a decent sum of money, though not enough to restore his fortunes permanently. He would eventually be appointed as U.S. Consul to Tabasco, Mexico, and later to Trinidad, Cuba, but he never escaped the shadow of his debts. The Confessions of Nat Turner, however, would outlive him and become one of the most important documents of the antebellum period. The Confessions of Nat Turner remains one of the most important and controversial documents in American history. Scholars debate how much of it truly represents Turner's words, and how much Gray shaped, embellished, or invented. Gray clearly had his own agenda. In the introduction to the pamphlet, he called Turner a fanatic whose mind was warped and perverted. He wrote that looking at Turner made his blood curdle. Gray blamed the rebellion on colored preachers and white pastors who preached about equality. He was, by any reasonable standard, a slavery apologist writing propaganda designed to defend the institution. And, yet, many historians believe the core narrative is substantially accurate. Turner's voice comes through in certain passages, particularly his descriptions of his visions and his religious beliefs. The specific details about the rebellion match what we know from other sources. Turner himself acknowledged the confessions as accurate when they were read before the court. The document gives us insight into a man who genuinely believed he was an instrument of divine justice, who saw himself participating in a cosmic battle between God's kingdom and the forces of evil. Whether we accept his religious experiences as genuine spiritual phenomena or as symptoms of mental distress, they were clearly real to him and provided the motivation for his actions. After Turner's execution, his wife Cherry was tortured under the lash in an attempt to make her reveal papers he'd supposedly hidden. This detail, reported in the Richmond Constitutional Whig and later recounted by the abolitionist writer Thomas Wentworth Higginson, reveals the extent to which authorities feared Turner's influence might continue even after his death. They wanted to find any writings, any documents, anything that might contain his ideas or plans. The torture of a woman whose husband had just been executed demonstrates the paranoia that gripped white society in the rebellion's aftermath. Some papers were apparently surrendered under the lash, though their contents have never been discovered. The immediate aftermath of the rebellion was catastrophic for black people throughout the South. Virginia's legislature, which had been debating gradual emancipation proposals for years, convened special sessions to address the crisis. Roughly 2,000 Virginians sent petitions calling for action on slavery. Thomas Jefferson Randolph, the grandson of Thomas Jefferson, introduced a plan for gradual emancipation coupled with colonization, resettling freed people in Liberia. William Broadnax, who had commanded the militia that suppressed the rebellion and who himself owned more than 100 enslaved people, submitted a detailed proposal that would have used tax revenue to relocate 6,000 black people from Virginia every year. He calculated that within 80 years, there would be no enslaved people left in Virginia. Broadnax argued that slavery had caused the decay of our prosperity and the retrograde movement of this once flourishing commonwealth. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that Turner's rebellion might actually force Virginia to confront the fundamental evil of slavery. Newspapers in Richmond argued for abolition. Even many slaveholders seemed shaken by what had happened. The debates in the Virginia legislature during the 1831-1832 session represented, according to historian Eva Shepherd Wolfe, the most public, focused, and sustained discussion of slavery and emancipation that ever occurred in any Southern state. But the votes fell short. Fear ultimately hardened into reaction. Instead of ending slavery, Virginia's legislature passed brutal new restrictions. These laws, enacted in March 1832, made the lives of enslaved and free black people far worse. Black people were forbidden from gathering for religious services unless supervised by white ministers. They couldn't hold religious meetings at night. Free black people lost their right to trial by jury and were to be tried in the same manner as enslaved people. Enslaved people were prohibited from preaching. Anyone, black or white, who possessed abolitionist literature could be prosecuted. Writing or distributing material that might incite rebellion became a felony punishable by death for black people and heavy fines, or imprisonment for white people. If a black person wrote, printed, or circulated any material advising insurrection, they would be whipped for the first offense and executed for the second. White people doing the same would be fined between $100 and $1,000. 300 free black people from Southampton County agreed to be exiled to Liberia, rather than continue living under these new restrictions. Other Southern states quickly followed Virginia's lead. Laws restricting black mobility, assembly, education, and religious practice tightened across the South. Teaching enslaved people to read or write became a crime in most slave states. The brief opening for discussing emancipation slammed shut. The South became, in historian Stephen Oates's phrase, a closed martial society determined to preserve its slave-based civilization at whatever cost. Slave patrols increased in number and authority. The surveillance and control of black people, enslaved and free, intensified dramatically. Possession of abolitionist publications was criminalized in Virginia and throughout the South. The rebellion had exactly the opposite effect of what Turner intended. Instead of sparking a widespread uprising that would overthrow slavery, it led to the creation of a more rigid, more brutal system of control that would last another 3 decades until it was finally destroyed by civil war. The window for peaceful abolition in Virginia closed. The state that had produced Washington, Jefferson, and Madison, the state where some of the founders had expressed moral doubts about slavery, now became one of the most committed defenders of the institution. Virginia would secede from the Union in 1861 and serve as the capital of the Confederacy. The path from Southampton County to the Civil War ran straight and bloody. In the North, the rebellion had a different impact. Abolitionists seized on Turner's story as proof that enslaved people were neither content nor docile, that they would fight for freedom when given the chance. William Lloyd Garrison published articles about the rebellion in his newspaper, The Liberator, though many white Southerners blamed Garrison and other abolitionists for inciting the violence. On September 3, 1831, Garrison published an article called The Insurrection, discussing the rebellion. On September 10th, The Liberator published excerpts from a letter warning that many Southerners believed the newspaper had a connection to the revolt, and that if Garrison traveled south, he would be killed. Turner himself likely never heard of Garrison or read abolitionist literature. His inspiration came from the Bible, from the Old Testament prophets who spoke of divine wrath and judgment, from his own visions and his conviction that God had chosen him as an instrument of liberation. The memory of Nat Turner's rebellion haunted the South for the next 3 decades. Every hint of slave unrest, every rumor of conspiracy, every act of individual resistance by enslaved people was interpreted through the lens of Southampton County. The fear never entirely went away. White Southerners knew, on some level, that they lived on top of a powder keg, that the people they held in bondage vastly outnumbered them in many counties, that their entire way of life depended on maintaining absolute control through terror and violence. Turner had shown them how fragile that control really was. When John Brown attempted to spark a slave rebellion at Harper's Ferry in 1859, the panic that swept the South echoed the panic of 1831. Among Brown's raiders was Dangerfield Newby, a formerly enslaved man whose wife and children remained in bondage. Brown's raid failed, but it confirmed Southern fears that abolitionists and enslaved people might unite to destroy the institution. Brown himself invoked higher law and divine justice, much as Turner had done. The rebellion also became a rallying point for black resistance to slavery. Enslaved people in Southampton County began marking time from Nat's Fray, or Old Nat's War. His memory was passed down through generations. Frederick Douglass and other black abolitionists invoked Turner as an example of heroic resistance. In the 20th century, Turner became an icon of black power and resistance. He appeared in literature, film, scholarly works, and popular culture as a symbol of the refusal to accept oppression. A man who chose violence over submission when no peaceful path to freedom existed. Tupac Shakur honored Turner with a cross tattoo on his back reading Exodus 1831, referring to the year of the rebellion. The 2016 film The Birth of a Nation, starring and directed by Nate Parker, told Turner's story for a new generation. But Southampton County itself struggled with how to remember the rebellion. Many white families lost ancestors in the violence. The Rebecca Vaughn House, the last surviving home where white people were killed during the rebellion, stood for generations as a physical reminder of those 2 days in August 1831. The Southampton County Historical Society eventually purchased and restored the house, adding it to the National Register of Historic Places in 2006. They created a driving tour of rebellion sites. Historians have worked to mark the locations where events occurred, to preserve the memory of what happened. Rick Francis, a white descendant of people killed in the rebellion, acknowledged its importance in pushing Virginia closer to ending slavery than it had ever been before, even though the opportunity was ultimately lost. The ethical questions raised by Nat Turner's rebellion remain uncomfortable and unresolved. Turner and his followers deliberately killed women and children. They didn't discriminate based on individual guilt or innocence. Their violence was collective punishment directed at the white community as a whole. From one perspective, this was terrorism, the targeting of civilians to achieve political goals. From another perspective, it was warfare, a desperate strike for freedom by people who had exhausted all other options. Enslaved people lived under a system of constant violence. They were bought and sold, separated from families, beaten, raped, worked to death. That violence was legal, sanctioned by the state, defended by churches, embedded in the economic system. Turner's violence was a response to that larger systemic violence. There's no easy moral calculus here. The death of a child is a horror regardless of the cause or context. But so is the daily horror of slavery, the separation of mothers from children on auction blocks, the whipping posts, the rape of enslaved women by their owners, the crushing of human dignity and aspiration under the weight of absolute power. Turner believed he was acting as an instrument of divine judgment, that the blood of enslaved people cried out for vengeance, that the time for peaceful change had passed. Whether he was right or wrong, whether his actions were justified or criminal, his rebellion forced white America to confront what slavery truly meant. In 1831, many white Americans preferred to believe a comfortable lie, that enslaved people were content, that slavery was a benevolent institution, that black people were incapable of organized resistance. Nat Turner destroyed that lie. He proved that enslaved people would fight for freedom, that they would risk everything, that they would not wait forever for gradual emancipation or colonization schemes devised by white people who claimed to have their best interests at heart. The rebellion was a declaration that enslaved people had agency, that they were historical actors rather than passive victims, that they could and would take history into their own hands. 3 decades after Turner's execution, the question of slavery would finally be settled, not by legislative debate or gradual reform, but by massive violence, by 4 years of civil war that killed more than 600,000 Americans and destroyed the economic and social system of the entire South. Historians have long debated how much events like Turner's Rebellion contributed to making that war inevitable. What's clear is that the rebellion made peaceful resolution more difficult. It hardened attitudes on both sides. It made compromise impossible. It pushed the South further into a defensive crouch, more committed to slavery precisely because they felt threatened. It gave Northern abolitionists evidence that slavery was inherently violent and needed to be destroyed immediately rather than reformed gradually. Nat Turner remains one of the most controversial figures in American history. He was a mystic, a preacher, a military leader, a mass killer, a freedom fighter, a fanatic, a prophet. He was all of these things. His story doesn't fit neatly into categories of hero or villain. What we can say with certainty is that he changed history. For 2 days in August 1831, he and his followers demonstrated that enslaved people would fight back, that submission was not inevitable, that the comfortable assumptions of slaveholders about the docility of their human property were dangerously wrong. The system responded with overwhelming violence, with new laws designed to prevent any future uprising, with 30 more years of increasingly rigid control. But the memory of those 2 days remained, a reminder that the entire edifice of slavery rested on force, that it could only be maintained through constant vigilance and violence, that it was inherently unstable and unsustainable. In Southampton County, markers now commemorate the rebellion. The Nat Turner Insurrection Historic Marker stands on Virginia State Road 30 near Cortland, dedicated in 1991. The Blackhead Signpost Road Marker was dedicated in 2021 at the intersection of Virginia State Route 35 and Meherrin Road. These markers acknowledge what happened without resolving the ethical questions it raises. They're attempts to remember honestly, to tell a story that includes violence and terror and resistance and brutal repression. They're acknowledgments that American history includes moments when enslaved people chose to fight for freedom using the only means available to them, and that those choices had consequences that echoed for decades. In 2002, scholar Molefi Kede Asante included Nat Turner on his list of the 100 greatest African Americans, recognizing him as a figure whose impact on American history cannot be denied, regardless of how one judges his actions. Nat Turner died believing he had done what God commanded him to do. He showed no remorse, no second thoughts, no apology. In his confessions, he insisted that he was acting as an instrument of divine justice, that the wickedness of slavery demanded punishment, that the blood of his people cried out for vengeance. He believed that history would vindicate him, that the truth of what he had done would eventually be understood. Whether you see him as a murderer or a martyr, as a fanatic or a freedom fighter, you cannot deny that he acted on his convictions with absolute commitment, that he risked everything and lost everything for what he believed was right. In the end, perhaps that's all we can say with certainty. Nat Turner believed in freedom, believed it was worth dying for, believed it was worth killing for. He forced America to confront that belief, to acknowledge that enslaved people were human beings who would fight for their liberty. He demonstrated that slavery could not be maintained without constant violence, that the myth of the contented slave was exactly that, a myth. He showed that the entire system rested on force and fear, and that force and fear could not hold forever. And 30 years later, when the nation finally tore itself apart over the question of slavery, when hundreds of thousands died in the bloodiest war in American history, the spirit of Southampton County hung over the battlefield like a ghost that had never been laid to rest. The 2 days in August 1831 had proven what many knew but few acknowledged, that slavery was inherently violent, inherently unstable, and would eventually destroy itself in blood and fire. Nat Turner had given his life to deliver that message, and America had spent 3 decades trying and failing to ignore it.